Hello and welcome to my hopefully easy to understand guide to industries for newspapers, A-level, media studies on the EDUCAS exam boards. It's important to realise that if newspapers comes up in section B of component 1 for the A-level media studies exam, it will be to do with industries and audiences. That means that if for an industries and audiences question, you should be considering a whole edition of the newspaper that you have studied in class or at home, as well as the newspaper's websites and social media pages. The set covers that you may have studied in class are only if newspapers comes up in section A, media language or representation. It doesn't matter what day's edition you look at, as long as you have looked at an entire edition of each newspaper and had a look at their website and their social media pages as well. And you should be prepared to use specific evidence from those whole newspapers and the websites and social media pages in your answers for industry and audience-based questions. If you get newspapers in an industry question at A-level, it's quite factual, which means you're going to need to learn to remember lots of things, which I appreciate is quite difficult for some people, but it will help you to answer the questions. It's lots of information about things like the circulation and readership of the newspapers and the companies that make them and how they're regulated. And so on the screen right now, you're going to see a list of all the kind of things you're going to need to know for industries, for newspapers at A-level. And I'm going to try and go through a few of these things now just to make them a little easier to understand. So I'm going to start with the word ownership. Ownership is a word that freaks a lot of people out when they see it because they don't really understand about there being somebody that owns a newspaper. But actually, it's really just about the companies and the people that are involved. You need to understand the companies for both the Daily Mirror and for the Times, and understand a little bit about those organisations and how that might impact upon the newspaper and their success and various other issues. Daily Mirror is made by a company called Reach plc, formerly known as Trinity Mirror. So you might see it referred to as Trinity Mirror in any resources that you look at online, but it is now called Reach plc. I would advise trying to use the words Reach plc if you are referring to the owners or production company publishers of the Daily Mirror in an exam situation. Reach plc is really quite a big organisation. They produce and publish over 150 odd newspapers, several of which are national, like the Daily Mirror, the Sunday Mirror, the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, but they also have diversified and now produce and publish a range of local newspapers as well, which has helped them to make more money as a company and stay a success. Being very horizontally integrated like that and actually continually buying out other companies and other newspapers, for example, they bought out the Daily Express about 2 years ago, means that they can maintain their position as a leader within the newspaper industry. It means they can get rid of their competition, they can stay powerful, they can stay as a leader within the market, and they essentially are going to have a reasonable amount of power as a result. It's also quite handy because they can actually share resources and facilities and journalists between their different newspapers. So, for example, the Daily Mirror and the Daily Express are both made by Reach plc, and they share journalists. So if a journalist writes a story for the Daily Express, then they can share that story with the Daily Mirror at no extra cost. And it means that they can have a story in both of their newspapers at the cost of writing and editing just one story. So it can be quite helpful to be horizontally integrated and to have a range of similar products because it can save you money and resources. The Times newspaper is published by a company called Times Newspapers, which is owned by News UK, which used to be called News International, which is wholly owned by an enormous conglomerate called News Corp. So actually the company that publishes the Times is a subsidiary of a giant conglomerate that operates across the globe, making hundreds of newspapers, magazines, TV programmes, and is even involved in TV news and film as well. So it really is a giant global conglomerate. Being fully vertically and horizontally integrated like this within a giant conglomerate is very, very useful for the Times. It means that they have got an enormous amount of money at their disposal. It means that they can afford to take a few risks. For example, they can afford to have a paywall on their website, which might actually repel a lot of audiences. But they have loads of money, so at the end of the day, they can afford to take risks like that. It means that they have a lot of resources at their disposal. They can share journalists and stories between their different newspapers. They can distribute their paper and their material globally using any one of the subsidiary companies that are part of the News Corp conglomerate. It means they have a huge amount of power at their hands as well. So, for example, when it comes to their newspapers, perhaps breaking the rules, bending the rules, if you've read about the phone hacking scandal and the Leveson inquiry, they've actually managed to escape a lot of the kind of potential sanctions, punishments and fines as a result of some of those rule breakings that they have taken part in. And that is potentially because of their power and funding and influence. The man who owns the conglomerate at the top of this kind of hierarchy is Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is a global billionaire. He's Australian, but he lives in America now. He is quite conservative. Most very rich people are quite conservative in terms of their political views. He's also a Republican Party donor. So within America, he has donated money in the past to the Republican Party and to Donald Trump, which you could suggest might mean that he and his papers might have a tendency to be slightly more right-wing. It could give them a political bias. But actually, News Corp have tried to pride themselves on having journalists who come from a whole range of political backgrounds, and their political perspective, they say, is a bit more neutral, or what we sometimes call centralist. So you will find that a lot of their stories aim to try and be a bit more neutral and centralised rather than really right-wing or really left-wing. And you'll probably find this in some of the articles you look at within the Times. One thing you could say about the way newspapers are owned by shareholders and stockholders is that it actually has quite a big impact on the way they operate as a company. It's important that they protect the reputation of their newspapers, whilst also trying to appeal as much as possible to their target audience in order to make as much money as possible. So they have to tread quite a fine line between having shocking stories and being as engaging and unique as possible, but not creating so much bad publicity for themselves that they rock the boat and potentially damage their reputation as a company. And an example of when this has happened in the past is when News Corp was discovered to have had several of its newspapers involved in the phone hacking scandal. You can Google this and look up more information on it. One of the newspapers it made at the time, the News of the World, was heavily involved, although some of its other newspapers like The Sun and The Times had also been involved too. And what happened was it caused a huge amount of bad publicity for the company, and it started to damage the stock market and the shares of the company overall. They made a business decision based entirely on money and reputation. This ties in quite neatly with Curran and Seaton's profit and power theory, and also Hesmond Howell's minimising risk and maximising profit. They shut down the News of the World. They chose to stop printing one of their biggest newspapers to try and damage control the situation and protect the reputation and the worth of their other newspapers, such as The Sun and The Times. In terms of regulation, you need to understand that the company that regulates both the Times and the Mirror is IPSO, I-P-S-O. There is another company called Impress, which is a government-run organisation, but the Times and the Mirror don't belong to it. The only newspaper that does really belong to it is The Guardian, out of the main newspapers within the UK. But the Times and the Mirror, the Daily Mirror, belong to IPSO. Now, IPSO is a newspaper-run regulatory board, and I suppose belonging to a regulatory board shows that they understand that they do need to control some of the things they put into print and on their websites in order to remain successful and within the law. So, for example, IPSO might govern what language they put in their newspapers. It might stop them from doing anything truly offensive or horrendous or harmful. IPSO might prevent them from publishing libelous material, which is printed material which could damage someone's reputation if it's false. And so being part of a regulatory board is a good way of trying to control some of those aspects. Some people say that IPSO could be said to be a little biased. It is run by the newspaper industry themselves, and as a result, it's kind of newspaper employees governing themselves. And as such, some people might say that that could lead to bias and them not perhaps being as strict on their rule breaking as they could be. Ipso doesn't follow the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry, unlike Impress, and it's quite telling that both the Times and the Daily Mirror chose to join Ipso despite knowing that it wasn't following the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry. It might suggest that newspapers are only going to do the bare minimum necessary to regulate themselves, just to stay just on the right side of the law, because they know that they want freedom of speech. They want to be able to have freedom of the press and be able to write the stories they want to write. But they also want to try and be sometimes a bit controversial or a bit shocking with their stories, without fear of prosecution or punishment or sanctions, because that is what sells newspapers. You also need to kind of have a think about how difficult it is to regulate newspapers now. Apart from the fact that stories are controversial and sometimes news pictures can be quite graphic, or bloody or gory if it's about a horrifying event that's happened in real life. It's also incredibly difficult to regulate newspapers because of technology. Ipso is responsible for the regulation of newspaper websites as well as the printed paper. Whilst newspapers can control what they put online, most newspapers also offer the audience an opportunity to contribute themselves in terms of submitting their own ideas or commenting on articles. And this presents a problem in terms of regulation, because audiences will often not understand what the rules are or not care what the rules are. And so most newspapers, including the Times and the Mirror, use bots and algorithms to try and moderate their website comments. Now, one of the problems with using technology to moderate and regulate the comments is that they can't always identify context, or cultural references. And so sometimes they might moderate or censor things which are completely normal and inoffensive, and sometimes they might fail to censor or moderate or notice things which are hugely offensive or inappropriate, but that the algorithm just can't detect. Audiences are quite clever at doing things like messing around with the spelling of their swear words, or managing to be racist or homophobic or sexist or Islamophobic without actually using a trigger word that will notify a bot or an algorithm that something offensive has been done. Most newspapers now employ human moderators to go through comments on their website. Human moderators are quite good because they can see context and they can look at whether something might have been intended to be offensive or racist, sexist, etc. The problem with human moderators is that they are human. They can't read as much content as a computer can. And some articles on websites manage to gather sometimes tens of thousands of comments in the space of just minutes, which a human moderator just would never be able to look through. So technology has made the moderation of newspapers and the effective regulation of newspapers very, very challenging. So technology has had quite a negative impact on the success of newspapers in general. Have a look at the two newspapers that you've studied, the Daily Mirror and the Times. The Daily Mirror's circulation has been quite rapidly declining for a number of years. And that's potentially because its target audience is going online. The Daily Mirror's website is free, as are many newspaper websites now, because they have to be in order to compete with other websites. And so their circulation of the printed paper and the readership of the printed paper are in decline. But their website online readership is really quite large. It's one of the largest in the country. So they do really well online. And that's potentially why newspapers have diversified into online news, and they all have an online edition, because it helps to maintain that digital audience, and it helps to tackle their falling print circulations and therefore falling profits. And they can still earn money through the digital websites, and that is because it enables them to use digital advertising and offer that to brands and companies as well. So it opens up an extra stream of revenue. The Times circulation is actually not declining like the Daily Mirror. If you look at different years, depending on what statistics you look at, it's either increasing or staying the same, which is quite unusual in comparison to most other newspapers. And you have to think about why that might be. The Times audience is a bit older than the Daily Mirror, and they're also potentially a little bit more middle class to upper class, a bit more educated, and therefore perhaps more likely to have still got an interest in printed newspapers, which are seen as quite a cultural product. Because they're a bit older, they're less likely to use digital media as much, which might explain why their readers are still sticking with printed newspapers as opposed to migrating online. Another reason why the Times audiences haven't deserted the printed newspaper is because the Times actually have a paywall on their website, which restricts people from being able to access all the content unless they pay. So that might stop some of their audiences from actually paying to subscribe online, and they therefore might stick with the printed paper. But the Times can afford to take this risk because their audiences are richer. They're more likely to pay for content online. And sometimes paying for something makes it feel like it's higher quality. And so actually it can act as an engaging factor for audiences because they are convinced that if they're paying for the Times website, it must have a higher quality in terms of content. Both newspapers have lots of other ways of making money. These alternative revenue streams are really important for newspapers to help keep their profits high. So the Daily Mirror has lots of advertising space online. They also offer things like premium rate phone lines within the newspaper so that people can phone up and get their horoscopes or betting results and gambling tips. They can phone up and get the national lottery results and do all sorts of other things via these premium rate phone lines. Online on the Daily Mirror's website, there are lots of other alternative revenue streams for them as well. So the Daily Mirror has a betting website, a betting section of their website, which you have to sign up to and use card details in order to bet. They also have a dating section to their website as well, which again, you have to pay for. So opening up lots of other digital revenue streams is important for newspapers to maintain their profits. The importance of the websites for the newspapers might reflect Clay Shirky's ideas and also Henry Jenkins' ideas about the audience becoming much more active because of technology, wanting to speak back to producers, create their own content in the forms of comments and stories and chatting with other people online. And so online editions of newspapers, their apps and things like that as well, their social media pages are a good way of showing that audiences for newspapers really are intrigued and engaged by the technology that they use. Daily Mirror has had to try and engage those target audiences who like interaction using its website and using the printed paper as well. So, for example, offering lots of interactive elements, competitions, phone-ins, text-ins, the ability to comment, like and share is a really important part of the newspaper industry and keeping it relevant and current for audiences. It is quite important to look at the advertising as well, both in a whole edition and on the website too. The adverts are often very much tailored towards the target audience. So in a copy of the Daily Mirror, you are much more likely to see adverts for shops like Tesco's, Lidl, Aldi, McDonald's, for example. And in the Times, you're much more likely to see adverts for shops like Waitrose, Marks and Spencer's, Harrods. That is because they're targeting different demographics in terms of class and financial situations. So using the adverts to engage a very particular audience is quite important with both newspapers. The target audience for the Daily Mirror is predominantly working class. They are probably mostly male, over the age of 35, left-wing in terms of their political views, and in terms of their sort of social demographic, they probably fall into the C2, D and E categories, which if you're not sure what that means, you can look it up online. So it's important with the audience section for newspapers to be able to look through a whole issue of the newspaper, not the set covers for section A, and to be able to identify parts of that newspaper and also parts of the website that are specifically designed to engage those audiences. For example, on the website, what would predominantly engage the audiences who are working class, for example, or have lower incomes, are those opportunities to earn more money. So things like lottery results, gambling, the ability to enter competitions and win holidays. All of these are things that are either on the website or in the printed paper on a reasonably regular basis that would help to engage those people on a lower income. The Daily Mirror features quite a lot of left-wing articles, so they are articles that feature Labour or the Lib Dems in a much more positive light, and they are articles which perhaps are going to represent the Conservative Party or UKIP, Nigel Farage and anyone from the Republican Party or Donald Trump in a reasonably negative fashion. And so seeing and identifying some of these articles from either a whole edition of the newspaper, and you can choose whatever edition or day's paper that you want, or from their website is quite important in being able to explain how they appeal to those left-wing audiences. Daily Mirror readers have a slightly lower reading age than the readers for the Times, and so because of that, they tend to be engaged more by soft news, so that is entertainment-based news, celebrities, sports, etc., not politically hard-hitting or financial news. And so what happens is in the Daily Mirror, you will see lots of articles that feature very large pictures, smaller amounts of writing, and tend to focus on softer news stories. By contrast, the Times' readers are slightly higher educated and have a slightly higher reading age. And so the stories tend to be much more in-depth with a lot more writing, much more complex language and jargon, and smaller pictures. And you will see this on their website as well. And that is a good way of engaging those readers who perhaps want something more academic or complex to read. The target audience for the Times is slightly more conservative than the Daily Mirror, but it's worth having a look at both the printed paper and the online version to see how they've managed to target people with that political standpoint. Because of the paywall, people who visit the Times website are offered the chance to sign up for free and receive 2 article views a week. They do this to act as almost like a little taster so that audiences get to view a little bit of an article and see what it's like, and that will hopefully encourage them to sign up for a paid subscription. If you don't return to the Times website once you've signed up, the Times will send you regular weekly emails reminding you to come back to the website and telling you some of the articles they think that you might particularly like based on the preferences that you ticked when you first subscribed. You can also complete the infamous Times crossword online if you subscribe as a paid member. And if you half complete the crossword, it will regularly send you emails reminding you that you have an incomplete crossword. The Times website offers a variety of competitions that would appeal to its target audience, with prizes ranging from tickets to the Royal Shakespeare Company, wine tasting events, and even events to listen to previous Prime Ministers speak in public. These are clear indicators of the both class and income of the target audience for the Times. It's important with newspapers to be able to explain and understand how audiences might use newspapers in different ways. So think about the uses and gratifications theory. You can look this up online if you don't know it already. Many audiences will read newspapers for information and education. That was primarily a newspaper's purpose when they first started being printed. So many audiences will look for information and education on current affairs, political events, and things that are happening both in Britain and around the world. But actually, a number of newspapers are now being read for entertainment value. They're being read for the funny stories, the silly things, the shocking stories. So actually trying to make news seem quite exciting and dramatic is quite a key part of engaging audiences. Lots of audiences will like to be able to identify or relate to stories. So, for example, in the Daily Mirror, they'll often feature stories about people who are struggling to live in poverty or on benefits because they know that many of their readers come from lower income backgrounds. So giving them stories that they can relate to is a good way of engaging them and making them feel like the newspaper really understands them and their life. And offering audiences social interaction is also really good, whether that's letting them interact within the newspaper by texting or phoning in, or whether it is encouraging social interaction online via comments or chat forums. Some newspapers even offer opportunities for the audience to escape into a better life or the idea of a fantasy world. So, for example, in the Daily Mirror, they often run competitions where you can win tens of thousands of pounds or exotic holidays. And so this idea would particularly appeal to those working class readers who would dream of having this quite middle class aspirational lifestyle. If you have a think about Stuart Hall's reception theory, there are many reasons why an audience might take a preferred negotiated and oppositional reading to the two papers, and it entirely depends on who it is that's reading it. So, for example, a left-wing audience is more likely to take a preferred reading of the Daily Mirror, whereas they would be more likely to take an oppositional reading of the Times, because the newspapers either do or don't reflect their political viewpoints. If somebody is much younger, say for example a 16, 17-year-old might take an oppositional reading to both newspapers because they might feel that both of them are too complex or hard to understand or boring. Some younger readers might find the idea of a printed newspaper quite dull and be more used to spending time online, so they might take an oppositional reading to the printed version of either newspaper. So it's important to have a think about all the different reasons why somebody might react differently to newspapers and their websites. Don't forget, if you want to learn more about media language and representation for newspapers, then check out my other videos about the Times and the Daily Mirror.